Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Loris Taylor, President and CEO of Native Public Media, as well as a lifetime member of IJA. She is our moderator for this session.
Thank you, Kyler, and thank you also, Kevin, Seth, and Mary. That was really just mind-boggling. My head hurts already. But welcome, good afternoon. Our world is changing every second, even today. Public trust, constitutional restraint, and governance integrity are facing mounting pressures, causing fractures in alliances, policies, funding, and our future. When systems deviate from their intended purpose and law, the risks are profound for tribal nations and their citizens. In this context, journalistic coverage of Indian country sits at the intersection of law, tribal sovereignty, governance, and constitutional responsibility. Journalists translate complex governance and legal structures into accessible stories. They shine light on systems of accountability, and in doing so, strengthen both tribal sovereignty and constitutional integrity. We are really fortunate today to have an incredible group of journalists. Let's learn more from our panelists about the tools they use in reporting stories about Indian country, which can be complex and nuanced, as you heard from Seth and Kevin today. My first guest is Deb Krol. Deborah, in your reporting on the Colorado River receiving personhood status from an Arizona tribe, you demonstrate how tribal governments assert their inherent authority in powerful and innovative ways. Can you walk us through that story and explain how it shows tribal nations using their sovereign power to protect their sacred homelands and natural resources? And for those who may be new to this principle, what does personhood mean in a legal and cultural sense? Deborah?
Well, hi, thanks for having me on. The notion of rivers as legal persons actually originated about 20 years ago, and have made use of this mechanism to extend greater protections to their waterways. The first ones to do this were one of the Maori Iwis or tribes in New Zealand, which extended legal personhood to the Wanganui River. They have been consulting with different groups of indigenous peoples, including tribes here in the United States, on how they can better protect their waterways. The Crit, or Colorado River Indian tribes, we call them Crit for short, is actually the third tribe in the North American continent to engage in this activity. The Yuroks have extended part of legal personhood to the Klamath River, which I've also reported on extensively. There was a First Nations group which extended legal personhood to the Magpie River in eastern Canada, and now Crit. It's really important to realize that granting this personhood gives the tribal nation or the indigenous people greater legal authority to protect their waters by suing on behalf of the river to polluters and to other people who are impacting water quality or wetlands quality. In the case of the Wanganui River, they are actually restoring the entire 140-mile long river. The personhood ordinance by Crit is governing the about 130 or 140 miles that the Colorado River goes through their tribal lands. But as Chairwoman Amelia Flores and other tribal leaders at Crit have stated, it's not just the water quality It's not just how much water they have the lease. It's not just commerce, but it's also part of their culture. It's part of their history. Um, they have long regarded the river as a living being, or having the the sources of a living being. So this is simply putting it into their tribal ordinances. Their cultural and historical relationship to the river. Um, it's important to note, though, that this has not yet percolated into federal law, as it has into New Zealand law, where their parliament actually passed legislation which authorized and provided the legal means to engage in protections of the entire river. But this is an important, what the tribe is telling me, this is an important step in preserving the Colorado River, which we all know is severely impacted and imperiled by overuse, by the continuing 25-year-long drought that is being exacerbated by climate change, and that's about all I have to say on this. If you want to talk about Colorado River in general and tribes relationship, I can talk to you about that all day. But this is just the next, it's a next step in protecting the entire river.
Thank you, Deborah. And if you have a specific question for Deborah, put it into the Q&A pod, and we'd be happy to answer your questions during Q&A. My next guest is Brian Bull. Missing and murdered Indigenous relatives is a huge issue in Indian country, and certainly a passion of mine. Your recent story featured a search team in Oregon utilizing AI sonar technology to locate a missing man. You also did a story about a young Native woman incarcerated in an ICE facility who was nearly deported. Why is it important for journalists to cover missing or endangered persons when the human stakes are high and governance systems fall short? Brian?
Well, the answer to that is in the question itself. The human stakes are high, and governance isn't reliable. It's a system that needs a lot of revising and a lot of revisitation and a lot of input. And there's a lot of elements, a lot of issues that are tied to MMIP. It's an overwhelming issue. It speaks to a long history of systemic oppression, the attack from the outside on traditional roles and reverence for people, including Native women and life, human trafficking, and the idea that it's open season on natives in a lot of communities, especially coming in from the outside as well. Journalists are essential to give these cases the historical, cultural, and legal context. Kevin Washburn, previous, gave a really good example of how sometimes the legal issues get very complicated quick. He mentioned the 1978 Supreme Court ruling, Oliphant versus Squamish, which I'll recap for anyone who missed his presentation, essentially stripped tribal courts of the ability to prosecute non-native offenders, which caused immense problems in Indian country. Many criminals, non-natives with bad intent, felt emboldened to go to tribal communities and carry out kidnapping, rape, assault, and worse with impunity. Nowadays, that's improved a little bit because we had the congressional actions with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act in 2013 and some more protective measures that empowered tribes in 2022. Now tribes have a little more muscle in prosecuting offenders, which includes cases of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, sex trafficking, stalking, and criminal violations of protection orders. But there's still a lot of room to improve, of course. what the Oliphant versus Aquamish ruling did for almost, well, close to 3 decades is it also kind of made it harder for tribes to apply immediate justice to cases and put the matter into the hands of the federal government, usually the U.S. Attorney's Office, which created a whole new level of judicial bureaucracy that robbed tribes and victims of immediacy and further complicated what was already a painful process. So hopefully going forward, we're going to be able to see tribes flex their muscle in the courts and in law enforcement and be able to um, bring non-native offenders to justice more readily. But again, I think that's a continuing discussion. The other thing that is important too is to always approach MMIP cases with care and not get into a pattern of thinking that they all share commonalities. In my time in covering MMIP, I've learned that every case is individual and you can't make assumptions. One thing I feel is very important for all journalists to do, native and non-native, is to do not inflict further harm. Fill out where the family is. The surprising thing I have found is that a lot of families and friends want to talk. I think when I've talked to young journalists who are entering MMIP as a beat, they're very cautious and they're stepping on eggshells. But I've often found with a lot of families, circles around the missing person or the murdered person, is that they want to share stories, they want to share accounts, they want to basically bring out the history that they shared with this person, things that made them laugh, things that they really remember about the person. And as long as you apply yourself with care and caution and respect and patience, don't press for graphic details. Don't venture into dark speculation about a case. It's not a true crime podcast, at least it should not be. And to remember that people in crisis don't owe you anything. You simply present the invitation and encourage them to talk about the person who's missing or murdered. And I think also an important thing too is that it's very easy to fall into a sense of despair. There's so many unresolved cases. There's so much lack of closure. But if you can highlight the efforts to aid people, the supporters, the community advocates, the people who are engaged in searches, make sure to highlight that that is happening, then it does not have to feel as dark and hopeless as many of these cases can feel. And it's also very important too to just network. I mean, I think a lot of information for contacting the victims' families, searchers, in most missing and murdered people cases, there's going to be flyers spread out in the community, spread out online. And it's pretty easy to just kind of network and start talking to people. One person who you can talk to will relay you to another person who's associated with the case or the investigation or in that person's circle. And I also just, try to work with the information that I have, again, with a lot of cases. One of the things that I've learned that is very curious to me is that getting back into the area of avoiding speculation is that when I talk to people, namely investigators and people who are directly affected by the case, most of them are working with known, confirmed facts and information. I even talked to a search coordinator once who said that they don't even disclose all the time if they're initiating a search. And they cited a case where the family knew ahead of time that there was a search underway, and they engaged themselves and got involved, and the search became disrupted and very difficult to carry out. And then the other part of it too, the other half of it was that they were going online and they were fomenting conspiracy theories and making accusations that had no basis in fact. And, as journalists and, people who are active in law enforcement and the judicial system already know, is you can't make accusations without evidence. Whereas in social media, it's almost kind of a Wild West scenario where almost anything gets thrown out into a comment thread. And so it's very important as a journalist to be shrewd and skeptical and make sure that you're applying the journalistic ethics of not inflicting further harm and making stories that are grounded in confirmable details and fact. And I guess the other thing I'd simply say too, before I pass it on to the next speaker, is just always work with the community and also know that no one case is the same. You may have an idea about what's happening behind the scenes, but until you actually speak to the people involved, I remember a case in the last year that a woman was found who had been missing for 2 years, a Native woman from the Dakotas, and she emerged in Portland, Oregon. And she was found and she was alive. And I assumed at the get-go that this was going to be a very positive, uplifting story. And could I talk to her? Could I talk to her parents about being reunited? And after a couple of days where I was absolutely getting no return on my invitations through phone and email and text, one of the coordinators, local coordinators of the searches, came back to me, and she said very discreetly that the family did not want to talk about the rescue because it wasn't like she had been kidnapped or abducted. What had happened behind the scenes that they didn't want into my article was that the woman was struggling with substance abuse and had fallen into a dark pattern of addiction, and that manifested itself by her leaving the home and being lost, in this case for up to 2 years. And so it was very difficult, personal, and somewhat awkward background to the story. And so I agreed to not pursue that particular angle. So, it's easy for us to think that sometimes there are malevolent forces, whereas it may be something that's in a whole different direction. And so keep yourself open to the possibilities. I've learned in my years of reporting on MMIP that, yeah, sometimes there are very sinister forces behind work, again, human trafficking or racial bigotry manifested through violence. But sometimes people disappear for very different reasons. I've even had a few people who disappeared deliberately because they were trying to avoid a difficult domestic situation, an abusive situation. And so, there's a realm of possibilities that you need to be aware of and keep yourself open to. So, yeah, again, it just is a matter of being open and being approachable and listening to the advocates and working with the searchers and the families with an open mind.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to pivot here because we don't have Troy Little Deer, and I wanted to share with you a window into policymaking that most often people don't see the innards of, and this is a really great segue from Brian Bull's presentation. So I don't know how many journalists in the room are aware that we have a national missing and endangered persons alert that's active today. This was my testimony to the Federal Communications Commission. And just to give you a window of what happened here, let's roll this tape.
Madam Secretary, please announce the next item on today's agenda. Madam Chairwoman and Commissioners, the fifth and final item on your agenda today is titled Wireless Emergency Alerts, Amendments to Part 11 of the Commission's rules regarding the emergency alert system, and will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau.
Now, before we hear comments from the bench, I want to welcome a special guest to our open meeting to provide some brief testimony and some insight. Thanks to the power of modern communications, we are virtually joined by Loris Taylor, who is a proud citizen of the Hopi Nation and has led Native Public Media as president and CEO since 2004. Last year, Native Public Media sponsored a resolution at the National Congress of American Indians Convention calling on us, the FCC, to establish a missing and endangered persons alert code. And so we welcome her testimony on this important issue. Ms. Taylor, please proceed.
Good day, Chair Rosenworcel and commissioners.
Native Public Media is a nonprofit organization serving American Indian and Alaska Native villages through media and communications. 60 radio and 3 television stations make up the Native Broadcast Network. Advocating for policies that utilize broadcast and broadband assets and support tribal communities is our mission. Technologies that include the integrated public alert and warning system, emergency alert system, and wireless emergency alerts. But let me tell you why this issue is important to me. On the Hopi Reservation in northeastern Arizona, my mother's younger brother was last seen on September 1st, 2013. My uncle, Eugene Vernon Kalnemptua, left the Kiputsmovi village store after work. The store's video captured his image at 7:12 p.m. as he walked out the door. He was reported missing 10 days later. Searches were conducted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Hopi Resource Enforcement Services. Eugene's information was placed in the National and Arizona Crime Information Centers. These 2 centers distribute missing alerts to other agencies. Flyers about Eugene were posted across the reservation. Eugene was never found alive. Ashley Loring Heavy Runner, 20 years old, disappeared from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana on June 5th, 2017. 2 weeks after Ashley was last seen, someone reported seeing a young woman running from a vehicle on US Highway 89 the night Ashley disappeared. Ashley was enrolled in the Blackfeet Community College studying environmental science. Her family continues to search for her, and a walk is held in Browning, Montana every year. Her case remains open. 34-year-old Willis Darendoff was last seen on November 10, 2020 at a hotel in Fairbanks, Alaska. His mother, Gladys, said she spoke to Willis on the phone the day he disappeared. Gladys traveled from her home in Huslia to Fairbanks and stayed there for 8 months, organizing search parties and using Facebook to rally community members. His case is still open. A missing and endangered persons event code for adults could have made a difference for Eugene, Willis, and Ashley. Thousands of families have suffered similar traumas across Indian country and nationwide. In 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing Native women and girls, but only 116 cases were logged in the Department of Justice database, according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 2022, more than 10,000 Indigenous people were reported missing through the FBI's National Crime Information Center. That's a higher rate of disappearing than the general population, and these are only reported cases. The Missing and Endangered Person Resolution, sponsored by Native Public Media, endorsed by the National Congress of American Indians, and elected tribal leaders nationwide, underscores the critical need for an adult missing and endangered person event code, particularly for addressing the pandemic across Indian country. The suffering is real and long-term, and today we have the collective opportunity and the technology to change the trajectory for families and communities across Indian country and the nation. Aswali Dawae, thank you.
Our work owes an absolutely enormous debt of gratitude to Native Public Media for bringing this issue to us, to our attention. So a really big thank you to Loris Taylor, who we are so honored to have here today. She said in a letter to us, and I want to quote, that by working collaboratively, we can make meaningful strides in addressing the challenges posed by the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis and enhance the safety and well-being of Indigenous peoples and American people in general. I totally agree, and we're going to get it done. We will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
Commissioner Symington.
Approve.
Commissioner Gomez. Approve. The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges as requested. Thank you again to Loris Taylor and Native Public Media for joining us today. We're going to get this done.
Okay, so I think that's a good segue into just talking about how policy affects tribal communities. And I'm available to talk more about this alert to the journalists in the room who might be interested in doing more work. Brian, you're a likely candidate. So thank you so much for listening to that. And now we're going to move on with our program. If you have any questions, don't forget to place them into the Q&A pod. My next guest and final guest is Graham Lee Brewer. Graham, the recent government shutdown and ongoing budget uncertainty revealed how deeply the federal government has funded tribes on discretionary rather than guaranteed federal funding. Your reporting demonstrates how massive funding cuts strain the federal government's long-standing fiduciary and treaty-based obligations to tribal nations. If the federal government treats the trust obligation as just another budget item, how does that affect tribal nations, and what steps can remedy those impacts? How can journalists clearly explain the legal foundations of the federal trust responsibility so the public understands that cuts to tribal programs are not routine budget choices, but a potential breach of legal duty? Graham?
I thank you, Loris. I think trust responsibilities are like many areas of just federal Indian law sovereignty that most people in the public don't really have a good grasp on or are not aware of at all. And I think that it also includes journalists. So for reporters, I think it's really important that you familiarize yourself with what the trust responsibilities are. As Loris was saying in my introduction, we've really seen over the last 9-10 months just how important these trust responsibilities are, because they have incredible impacts on tribes when they're not fulfilled. So these are some of the country's oldest legal commitments, some of its oldest legal and moral obligations. And I think, just to put it simply, these are what the U.S. government promised in return for the land and resources that they took to build the country. This has shaped out in a variety of ways under the Trump administration. You saw the federal cuts that DOJ made to HHS, to the Bureau of Indian Education, where there were all of these cuts to federal employees in particular whose job it was to fulfill these trust obligations. These are trust obligations, by the way, that have never been fully fulfilled and continue to be underfunded. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't really just underfunding places like Indian Health Service. That's Congress saying that it's not going to fully meet its legal obligations. It's breaking the law in a sense. And so I think for us as reporters, it's really important that we understand those things so that we can hold those people accountable when they fail to meet those obligations. And so, like I mentioned, this isn't just understanding a treaty or a legal obligation. It's understanding who within the federal government is responsible for fulfilling those obligations. And so like I said, you've seen this play out a variety of ways under the Trump administration. There's no treaty right that says specifically that, the government is to establish IHS, or that the government has to establish the Bureau of Indian Education. That's the way that those treaty rights are interpreted today, and those departments are the result of those treaty rights, so those trust responsibilities, which can also come in the forms of acts of Congress or other forms of legislation. And so like I said, they're extremely complicated. So Bureau of Indian Education, for instance, I think some of the obvious ones are the schools, the elementary grade level schools that the Bureau of Indian Education runs or funds. But this also comes in the form of competitive grants to tribal colleges, which the majority of which get most of their funding from the federal government. That's one of the three pillars of the trust responsibilities is education. And so, but if you talk to a lot of Native education organizations like the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, or even college TCU presidents themselves, will also tell you that trust responsibility comes in the form of the education of all Native students, even the ones that don't attend TCUs. So when funding is taken away from other minority serving institutions, as it was to increase the funding to TCUs in September with that reallocation of that discretionary spending on education, it's taking away from students that go to other institutions too. And so understanding those complexities will really help lead you to better reporting so that you can, like I said, hold those departments and department heads accountable. I think a lot of the reporting that we see in Indian country historically and even still today is very reactionary. It's, we call it a lot parachute journalism. I think we're probably all familiar with that term, which is just coming in and covering the symptoms of a problem, especially when they're perceived as tragic. But in order to do really impactful accountability reporting, I think we need to know why those things happen the way they do. And the way to do that is to, like I said, understand how those trust responsibilities are met or not met on a daily basis. So, we saw a recent huge reduction in force at the Office of Indian Education, which administers grants to all sorts of schools. As I mentioned, HHS, I think we're all familiar with the way that staff and faculty was decimated at Haskell and SIPI, and then how tribes had to come back in and basically claw back that kind of funding. I had the same thing happen, and I think that's kind of the new norm that we're seeing under this second Trump administration, is that cut first and then put even more of a requirement on tribal governments, tribal leaders, and organizations that advocate on their behalf to try to get those things back by explaining that they're part of a very important legal obligation that the country has to these tribal nations. And this is also a reflection of the lack of knowledge about trust responsibilities within the federal government right now. Not only do you have agencies, so-called agencies like DOJ as well, being run and operated by people who don't understand trust responsibilities, the people within the government who worked under both Republican and Democrat administrations, who are lifelong federal workers who have deep, intimate knowledge of not only the trust responsibilities, but also have very long relationships with the tribes that they administer them to. They're now gone. And so what that leaves you with is, I think Section 106 is a really great example of this, where you had several tribal consultation experts who were in various departments across the federal government, whose job it was to make sure that that consultation on lands that could be impacted by construction projects, important religious, cultural sites, that consultation was done early and thoroughly. Those experts are now gone. The Biden administration hired a lot of people to do that kind of work, some of them on temporary basis, but still increased the government's capacity to make sure that it was that it was in compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act. When those people are gone now, a lot of that work falls onto employees like microbiologists, sometimes anthropologists, archaeologists, who don't have that kind of knowledge or those relationships with tribes. And so there's a lot of concern that those sites are now going to be at risk for greater harm. So again, all this is to say that understanding those trust responsibilities and also understanding the people who are tasked with it, making sure that they are fulfilled, will lead you to not only be able to to avoid just covering the fallout from those things, but actually really getting down to who's responsible to do it and why aren't they able to do it now under this current administration. And these are things, by the way, that, Laura's mentioned the discretionary spending. The Brookings Institution had a study that came out, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, that showed that the majority of the funding that pays for trust responsibilities is discretionary, meaning it's not guaranteed. During the shutdown, we certainly saw that impact tribes, and even a lot of the funding that is considered mandatory spending that meets the tribe's trust responsibilities was SNAP, and so even still, it can be impacted by the dysfunction of Congress and the federal government. And so these are things that have real impact on tribal nations, and there can be life and death for tribal citizens in many cases. And so if you want to do the kind of reporting that can really have impact and really get at that accountability element, understanding those federal complexities is paramount. And so that's not just getting to know tribes and TIPOs and other people within the tribal governments that administer them, but the legal experts that understand these things very well, and in some cases help the federal government define these the different mechanisms within the government that fulfills those trust responsibilities.
Thank you, Graham. I just recall a study, and I don't know how many of you have read Reclaiming Native Truth. They did a survey of different people across the US, and one startling finding from that study said that court clerks and court personnel knew very little about Indian law across the country. And that was amazing to me, because these are individuals that deal with tribal issues, perhaps on a daily basis, and impact our lives. And if they don't know much about Indian law, or if it's not an undergirding of our judicial system, that's a little scary. So we have a lot of work ahead of us to try to inform our colleagues better in other sectors. So thank you, panelists. It's time for questions and answers. Kyler Edsity will host a Q&A. He's a premier journalist in his own right, and he will host our Q&A session. Kyler?
Thank you, Loris, and thank you again to all of our panelists. I think you guys shared a lot of great information today. So just for our audience, please place your questions into the Q&A pod, and then I'll just go through them. It looks like we have a couple already in the barrel. So this first question is from Mary Wilson from the Tohono O'odham Nation, a Native Resilience reporter, and this is for whoever wishes to speak on this question. How do we incorporate Indigenous science and worldviews into climate reporting while still producing hard accountability journalism about mining, water, and federal policy impacts on our communities?
I do this all the time. The first thing I do is I take time to talk with culture bearers, with elders, with people like Wensler Nosey, Twyla Cassador, Chairman Jose from Donna Otham, people who have that intimate relationship with the lands and the waters and the plants and the animal people and the flying things. And I learned what they think is important with their particular tribal indigenous science. Now, me being from California, I have that intimate knowledge of what my elders taught me about how the world works and what humans' role is in making sure things run on time. And because I had that training from my elders, then I went to ASU for science writing. So I have a little bit of information about and grounding in Western science. I have a grounding in Indigenous science, and I just put those together, and I translate Indigenous science into things that normal people, people who don't have a background in either science can understand. And again, as I have told my younger reporters I mentor here all the time, if you know one tribe, you know one tribe. So it's important, if you're going to report on what's going on in somebody else's, in another tribal community, you need to consult with the right people. And that takes time and it takes effort. Even myself being a Native woman, I've had to build these relationships up over time. and you approach them respectfully, and you also have to be respectful and cognizant of information that they deem is shareable with the public. Not everything that a culture bearer or a medicine person or an elder tells me is something that I can be releasing to the public. But that's why you build the relationships, and they will help you understand what we can share with the public and what we can't share with the public. But even just talking to people on background is a wonderful thing, because you get to learn this this other tribal nation's relationship to their lands and their waters. And I learn how that's similar and how it's different to my own. Now, how does that help you report things of accountability? Because especially in my Oak Flat and my sacred spaces coverage, I'm able to explain to the public why a tribal community thinks this particular piece of land or this particular water source or this particular mountaintop is sacred and why it needs to be protected. And again, you walk that fine line between what can be shared with the public and what is shared with you only. And it's a great way to hold, to write journalism that holds public agencies accountable, because most of these culturally important and sacred sites tend to be on public lands. So that gives me an extra tool in my toolbox to go and talk to the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, the various other federal agencies, and engage with them on why or why not are you protecting this land, and what are you doing to work with the local tribes to protect this land, and what are the barriers in protecting this land. And I'm going to say one thing about consultation, and I'll let another reporter answer. In all the 25 years I've been doing reporting on Indian country, which includes a lot of climate journalism, a lot of environmental journalism, um, other types of journalism, but primarily climate and environmental journalism, I have yet to talk to a tribe that felt that they were adequately consulted, or that the consultation that they did have was appropriate and robust and timely. That was one of the biggest complaints that I have gotten, is that these agencies are not timely. There has been some offshore wind projects proposed, and a lot of the tribes along the coast wanted to be consulted early on. And what they were told by the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, was that you're not going to be able to consult with anybody until the leases have been signed. And generally what happens is these companies come in, they develop these plans, they spend 10, 20, 30, $100 million on planning, and then all of a sudden they go to the tribe and say, what do you think of my $100 million plan? And the tribe is then put into a defensive mode. So anytime that you report, one of the most important things you also need to report on is how the consultation process is going, why have the federal agencies in charge of consultation not consulted with the tribes sooner, and what they're doing to encourage the people who hold claims, mining claims and land use claims, to consult with tribes sooner. And again, that's where the indigenous science comes in, because what the issues are, and you can explain these things to the public and go back and go talk to the agency. So I'll get off my soapbox now. Thanks for letting me answer.
I think you also need to consider that most people don't really understand that indigenous science and worldviews actually benefit them too. And so I think it helps to explain to readers that simple fact. I mean, you could take it in a variety of ways, like, the Standing Rock protests weren't just protecting the water for the tribe; they were protecting the water for everyone in that area who drinks it. When Doge dismantled USAID, which for decades had given money to Peruvian farmers to grow chocolate and not grow cocaine, and they take that money away, that doesn't just hurt Peru, that hurts you, because now guess what? There's going to be more cocaine in the United States. When governments in the Pacific Northwest kept Native people from doing prescribed burns, now we're going to see more forest fires, right? So like these indigenous worldviews in science, they are good for everyone. And I think showing your readers that it's not just that we're doing something nice for the native people who we took something from. It's like we're actually doing something beneficial that's going to help our children and our grandchildren, regardless of whether or not we're native. I think really is a way to get people to listen and pay attention.
To piggyback on that, I think that there's a growing receptiveness to native and indigenous science. Graham raised the excellent point of cultural burns, or as some people know it, prescribed burns. And we call it good fire because native people for millennia knew that setting fire to the landscape rejuvenated the landscape and removed pests and helped to help certain species of flowers and trees repopulate. So, we had a whole century and some of repression, cultural, or I should say fire repression by government agencies, which increased the tinderbox element of a lot of forests and produced bigger, more destructive wildfires. But there is now forest agencies I've seen in Oregon and California start working with tribes on fire management. And then another good example as of late is there's a growing call for dams to be removed. We've seen 4 federal dams removed on the Klamath River, and now people who have been keeping an eye on the salmon habitat say that the fish are now rebounding and coming back to their ancestral spawning grounds. And so I think it's just good to include the indigenous perspective, and the science bears out. There are agencies and researchers who back up, and oftentimes too, it's just the naked eye is being able to confirm that these practices yield very positive results for the environment.
Thank you, panelists. That was really insightful. I think we have just enough time for maybe about 2 more questions, and I'll take them from the audience here. Our next question is from Margaret Pierce, and Margaret says, regarding the Trump administration removing the MMIP report from the DOJ website, citing it as DEI, do you have any advice on how journalists can disentangle MMIP and other investigative stories from the stamp of DEI being used to delegitimize, minimize, and erase those stories?
I will hop on real quick. I don't know what specific reports that you're referring to, Margaret. I just took a look at the DOJ, there we go, website, and there is a missing and murdered Indigenous persons section where they have links to education, research, reports, links to Savannah's Act, the Non-Invisible Act, Tribal Access Program, and some data and research. So one thing I think that has happened over the last 7 months is that there were a lot of documents that were removed and taken down across a lot of government websites, most notably the Navajo Code Talkers from the Department of Defense website, that after some clamor and uproar, began to mysteriously repopulate. So I don't know the last time that you checked the Justice Department, but there seems to be a lot of information there that may have disappeared for a few weeks to a few months, but make noise. Anytime that you see something that is not in place, something that's disappeared, I have found that shaking the trees and making a little bit of noise is very useful sometimes in making these documents and reports reappear. The other thing I would suggest too is that if you, a lot of MMIP organizations, advocacy groups, they're either part of these reports or they've downloaded and saved reports in their own archival libraries. And so if you can't find something from the government website, feel free to circumvent the network and see if they don't have these reports themselves. But yeah, it's a frustrating process. We've seen, I think, still a lot of confusion as to what's happened with some of these reports, and the anti-DEI initiatives not really helped at all. But again, look at things, ask around. I think the Wayback Machine, if you're familiar with that, is a great tool in accessing URLs from months and years back. And so if you can't find it on the current website, you might be able to find it through those methods.
Thank you, Brian. Deborah, Graham, any reactions to this at all?
Just that I would add that this is, again, an illustration of the Trump administration, its lack of understanding of the unique relationships that tribal citizens have with the federal government, because these things are not DEI related. They're related to the nation-to-nation relationship that tribes have with the federal government. And so, yeah, I think just hammering home that point whenever you can is important, because it's the fact, it's the truth, right? It's how we have to approach these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I seem to have become the Trump whisperer around here when it comes to tribal issues. You know, cutting funding off for tribal colleges, and cutting funding off for tribal libraries, and then all of a sudden restoring it again. And it seems like a lot of my reporting has to cover how tribes are being. It seems like tribes are being kept off balance by, is he going to fund something this week, or is he going to rescind the funding this week? And we've seen things like, we've seen things like the Solar for All funding being cut, you know, which was cutting off supplying electric service to like 500 Hopi homes, homes in the Hopi tribal lands, you know. And again, it's important to note that reiterating the trust responsibility and reiterating the government to government relationship is very, very important, and we need to keep hammering on that. On the other hand, this last summer, the BIA, the DOJ, and several other law enforcement agencies within the federal government once again banded together to do a swarm into cold MMIP cases, which is encouraging, because even in the Trump administration, they are at least continuing to do something towards addressing this, and we reported on that too. So it's not all bad news, but there's a lot of bad news.
Thank you, Deborah. So I think we have time for one final quick question. This comes from Jay Jones, and they ask, how do you protect your data and sources while you are reporting and ongoing? Are there ideas of data ownership and sovereignty that play into your work and processes that align with tribal sovereignty? Yeah, whoever feels emboldened to answer.
I can say just briefly that I've reported on a lot of things related that are directly related to Indigenous data sovereignty, and I think it's just important to. I think you could say this about a lot of different data sets, even if they're not directly related to the concept of data sovereignty. That you should be having very open and honest conversations with the people, whether it's a tribal nation or a native organization or whatever, just about how you're going to use that data. Because, you know, to kind of get to the point of the question, I think a lot of data that we have, especially data that was taken, you know, over maybe the middle of the 1900s and things like that, is there was just no real equity in how that stuff was taken. And also, I think it wasn't really fully explained to a lot of people how it would be taken and used and be made public. And so I think you should just be very thorough in your conversations with how you want to use that data, how you want to present it. I saw Logan Jaffe was in here when we worked together on the repatriation project at ProPublica, and I know that the data team who worked on the compiling all of the information, the NAGPRA information that they compiled, was very thoughtful about not only what data we used, but how we presented it, the language we used around it to describe it, because that's very sensitive data, and we wanted I didn't work on the data portion of that, just the writing, but they wanted to be really thoughtful about that and make sure that we weren't, to Brian's earlier point, causing more harm. And so yeah, when it comes to the data that you're using, I think you just want to have very thoughtful conversations with the people that you're taking it from.
I just wanted to quickly mention that on top of the points that Graham raised too, that Buffalo's Fire, I think either on their website or through their newsletter, have issued a number of statements about tribal data sovereignty. So I invite anyone who's interested more in the topic to go check that out. And I think lays it out. We have a web guy who works with our outlet who I think is really passionate about it. Great speaker to have on it. But yeah, it is about protecting our data and information, and with our sources too. With every source I talk to, I just highlight in these very polarized times that this is how I'm going to use your voice. This is what I'm going to share in my story, and this is where it's going to go. And you just assure them, you give them as much information up front about how the information and story that they've given you will be used.
Thank you, Brian. A lot of great questions and a lot of great insights. So now I'll pass it over to Loris Taylor to give us her closing remarks.
All right. I think you will agree that Brian, Deborah, and Graham are really, really amazing. Our panelists show that journalism in Indian country is never just about reporting events. It is about revealing how law, sovereignty, governance, constitutionality, and lived experience converge to shape the daily realities and futures of tribal nations and their citizens. And to all of you, to meet this moment, journalists must listen deeply, learn continuously, and elevate Indigenous leadership in every newsroom. Thank you to our expert panelists, Deborah, Brian, and Graham. And thank you, Kyler, for your support. And I encourage everyone to continue this conversation. The work of telling Indigenous stories with accuracy, dignity, and care is ongoing, and it requires the collective effort of all of us. Askwali Dawaya.